All right, everyone. Welcome to Soul Sessions with Creative Mind. I'm Deborah, and I'm here with the lovely Dr. Rob.
Nice to be here.
And today's topic is creativity and coaching. And we're talking about how creative people can use Jungian work and of individuation, and how people that aren't creative will discover their creativity through individuation.
Yeah. Well, it's also part of our series on spirituality. So creativity and spirituality have always been linked. You know, recently we were talking about shamanism. If you think about the shaman's world, it was all about dance. It was all about painting the body, using sacred objects. It was about dreaming, these trance states, very creative in their rituals, creating rituals that would heal people, that would take people out of their ordinary states of mind into higher consciousness. So spirituality and creativity have always been linked for human beings. It's only in recent times that it's fragmented into these specializations, you know, that we only think of creative people as artists, or artists as the ones that are creative. But in reality, everyone is creative. And if you notice, that's when we're really happy as human beings. It's like the happiest.
It's like a play.
It's playful, it's open, it's non-judgment. And it's not actually just the producing the product of art, but it's the art making that makes us happy.
You know, it's interesting. A lot of our coaches that graduate our school and they talk about coaching is actually creative too, because there's a process where you kind of learn the system, and you learn the scripts, and you learn the techniques. But then when you really get into it, when you're with another person, that experience is actually very intuitive, very creative, very almost like an improvisation. So you're really basically tapping into that intuitive, creative self when you're doing it and when you're receiving it as well. It's like opening up to a different part of your mind that's, I would say, irrational, non-rational, non-linear to a creative way of working, and that's why I love Jungian work, because it is very creative, highly creative, instead of this linear kind of rational, structured way to approach the mind and approach life, taking steps, making goals, all those things. So let's talk about how art has been influenced by spirituality. I mean, back in the early days, like you said, the shamans would dance. They come up with songs. Even the Upanishads, the Vedas were sung.
Yes, all those traditions were about chanting, recitation, meaning memorizing incredibly lengthy poems and stories, and then acting them out.
And then Rumi had these swirling dervishes where they would do that ecstatic dance. And so there's so many different beautiful in indigenous cultures, you know, they had their different dances for different things they wanted to manifest, and even the rituals just in life, the passages of life, they would bring in kind of artsy experiences. They didn't just sit around and talk about it, they acted it out.
Yes, sand painting, the sand mandalas that the Tibetans make, very beautiful designs that represented the self, higher consciousness, pure awareness. And so, there is this deep connection between spiritual enlightenment and the creative process, the artistic process. But let's define spirituality and creativity.
I want to hear this.
So spirituality, and this is kind of for our own purposes, as a way of contextualizing it. So it's a search for meaning, spirituality.
That's a simple way to put it.
Right, and we know it's the search for meaning is a very human endeavor. we all need meaning in our lives. One of the definitions I remember when we were studying in clinical psychology was looking at what causes people to commit suicide. One of the main ones was the loss of meaning. They reach critical levels of meaninglessness in their life. And you cannot live without meaning. It is like the bread and butter for us.
Which is Viktor Frankl, A Man's Search for Meaning, was what kept him alive in the camp, is that meaning.
Absolutely. So spirituality definitely is at the heart of spirituality is this search for the meaning of life, of our own life and the meaning of life in general. Number 2 is cultivating a relationship with mystery. You were talking about this rational way of being. That
to
approach,
be irrational.
we love that approach. Of course, we love logic, the logos, the understanding, the reason. But we need that other element too. We need to understand that at the end of the day, it's a mystery. We can never explain it away. We can't rationalize it. We can't just devise the formula and say we're done. It is a living mystery, presence that persists there.
And you know what I like about that idea of the mystery is because sometimes we study like religions and certain doctrines, and we think this is the way it is. This is the rules. These are the way it is. And when you're talking about true spirituality, is asking and wrestling with, is it? Is that it? And like falling in love with the mystery, not having to have everything spoon-fed to you of what to believe, is true spirituality. Or otherwise you're in a religious, and the religion can have spirituality, but pure spirituality is that mystery and willing to ask or go where you haven't gone before, basically. Right,
and being comfortable with it.
Because
it's really uncomfortable from the logical reasoning side, because if you can't solve something, like, it bugs you. It's like it's disturbing in a sense. But the spiritual element is to cultivate that sense of we have to be okay with it. We're never going to figure it out logically, but we can have a direct experience of it.
Yes, and actually, just knowing something logically doesn't make you really know it on a deep level. You just it makes sense, but the mystery is direct experience with the mystery helps you know it.
Yeah. So search for meaning, relationship with mystery, and the third one is it's about transformation. All spirituality is about transformation. In other words, it's not just seeking God help me, or the divine, the universe please help me.
Like, I'm going to remain the same ego, and you just put me in a different situation where my ego's more comfortable, like in another relationship or more money, or right. It's about the personal, spiritual identity of who you are.
Yes, it's about finding the courage within ourselves to face the mystery and the challenge of life, and finding that meaning. And that not only requires transformation, but as you approach that mystery, it's going to transform you.
Yes. It's just like any hero's journey. You see, the person starts out as this ordinary person in their ordinary life, and they're thrust into some situation where they're forced to face an adverse situation, and through that, it transforms them. They become, it's like they gather strength that they didn't know they had. They found tools that they never knew they existed, even talents that they never knew they had. That's that spiritual transformation that happens. And we all rationally not want to take that journey. We all want to have everything just very easy and flowing, and but it's in that wrestling with what is life, who am I, that leads us to that transformation.
So that's the definition of spirituality that we're going by, and
we're sticking to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
There are other definitions, of course, and it's not a comprehensive one. But let's define creativity then. What do we mean by creativity? So the process of bringing something new into being, that's a direct quote by Rollo May, who was an existential psychologist. So it is this process of bringing something new into being.
Like a birthing a new child, or
very much so.
New life.
All creative work, and again, we're all creative as human beings. It's about bringing something unique into the universe. So the universe, like the word that we use as universal, or when we say universal, we mean that we all have it. We all share it. But the uniqueness is the opposite of that. And you notice that the universe manages to do that. We all share very similar minds, very similar bodies, very similar cultures, all the experiences.
Motivations.
But yet we do it in a unique way. Like there is nobody exactly like you.
And there'll never be another you.
Yes, it's a remarkable thing. And I think animals are the same way. There is, we see animals as one category, but it's essentially, no, each one is unique. And even within the species, even within, family groups, each individual is unique. Like
even
we all have our own
finger. Or have their own, even if they have identical DNA, they are different.
Yes. And so already we're set up to express something uniquely, something unique to us, or something that can only come through us. And Jung, of course, reflects that in his concepts of individuality and individuation. So that's the number one definition. The second one is that Jung saw it as an expression of our authentic self, or our true self. Meaning creativity is the expression of the self, of our true self.
Yeah, I like it. And it doesn't have to be creative. Like I think a lot of people think creative means to be great art, or you need to even be talented. Because I sing to you all the time, and I know I need voice lessons. But it's that expression. It's just coming from my heart, and it's playfulness, and
I think also what it means is that it's not just the surface personality persona, because he considered the persona as a type of mask that we wear,
the mask of the soul,
a role that we're playing, and so the real creative aspect of our individuality comes from our true self, not just from the experience of being a particular person, but that's where it connects to that spiritual quest. Because in order for the persona, or for us as personas, individuals, to find the authentic self, we have to undergo that transformation.
Yeah, it's not like you said, not the persona that's acting. And we're going to talk about ego inflation in the artist.
All the fun stuff.
Yeah. So what's the third one? Do you want me to read it? 2 types of knowledge. Rumi says there's a lower and higher knowledge in creativity.
Oh, sorry, that was my error in notes. That wasn't Rumi. This idea of higher and lower knowledge, it's actually goes back to the Upanishads, but it's the idea that in creativity, in working with creative ideas, with the creative process, we're working at 2 levels. One is at that persona level, of the individual, of dealing with lower knowledge. And lower knowledge, it's not putting it down in any way. It's simply saying lower knowledge is the stuff that we know about the world, the facts.
Let me ask you this. Would lower knowledge be kind of how to use the instrument, how to use the paintbrush, the kind of theory behind how to, like the mechanical part of the art itself, how to put words together and all that. And then the higher knowledge would be more the divine influence and infiltration of that. So you can play the same chord, but you can play it with your heart, or you can play it just, you see this in some of the talent shows where singers sing the notes perfectly. They know how to use their instrument, their voice, and they have beautiful tone, but there's no heart in it. Is that what you're saying? Like, I have all the mechanics, but I don't have the higher knowledge? In creativity?
Yeah, in relationship to creativity, yes.
There's other ways we talk about higher knowledge and lower knowledge, but this would be lined with creativity.
Yeah, in creativity, for example, we know in music there are musicians that are very technically precise.
Yes.
Meaning their techniques are superb and refined and to the highest standards. But they lack that creative soul.
Well, even pop music, you hear the same kind of tune all the time. And, it's even interesting, I've noticed, and I know that they do this on purpose, the TED Talks. If you watch TED Talks, you'll notice that they all have the same rhythm. They're the pause, and every talk is that same rhythm. And it's like, how can that be and the ideas are they're brilliant ideas, but it's almost like too robotic. I think they're changing it now, but if you notice that even something that's supposed to be creative as a TED Talk, we tend to make it into that conformity. So I guess it's a battle for creativity in a way. We take creative ideas and then we want to conform to it. Make them more like mainstream in a way.
Yeah, it's a struggle between formula and spontaneity, right? Because you see it in Hollywood too. When a movie is successful, then all the other studios go out to try to replicate that and make the same formula to see if it works for them. And it usually doesn't work for them because that's not what it's about, right?
Well, and you see things like Seinfeld. They said when the sitcoms were all kind of set up the same way, and there was a moral to the story at the end, and they said, no, there is no moral. It's actually like the opposite. And they would end the episode with no conclusion. It was always like a cliffhanger, and then you never knew what happened. And they just did things differently. They did a whole episode where they did it in reverse. So it's kind of breaking the rules would be that kind of higher. And then the lower would be just doing what you conform to. And the creativity is like, let me bring in something that has never been done before.
Yeah, I mean, art is like they say, it's hard to define, but I know it when I see it. It's that kind of principle that nobody can really define what it is because it is that higher knowledge. It's the expression of the higher self. And so you can't reduce it to a formula or to something specific and say, let's mass produce art, right? It has to be something spontaneous, unique, new, but at the same time, it's familiar. It's kind of that crossroad between the archetypal, meaning I recognize that somehow. It corresponds to something in me, but yet it's totally new or a fresh new way of doing the music, doing the sculpture, the painting, something.
And then these things in art where people kind of get on like one person like steps out and is the first person to do it. And then they're like, wow, that's like Picasso. That abstract art that was never done before. And then all of a sudden there were mini Picassos everywhere. Everyone tried to kind of take that and then create a whole new art out of it. And like, again, the movies had the same, they basically made movies based on stage performances, the old movies, the 50s. And then they were like, well, it doesn't have to be a show, like where everyone's dancing all the time. And then they started to work with different ways of producing movies and singing. Even now, this popular sitting on your throat singing, that kind of new that Adele brought into. So it's like then it's not unique anymore. It kind of loses. So if everyone's doing it, it kind of loses it. And so then we need another creative person to come in and stretch it again and do something different.
So we see that, yes, there's a lot of overlap between the definition of spirituality and creativity, and it goes back to that root that for human beings, the expression of art through dance, music, storytelling,
writing,
which it became literature, theater, acting. It was rooted in those shamanistic spiritual traditions of transcending the everyday life and connecting with the spiritual.
And like you said, finding meaning. So the story or the ritual had a meaning to it and why things happen. Why isn't there rain? Let's do a rain dance. And then because the gods need to know, there had to be some sort of meaning, I think, for us to feel connected to something. It just can't be just, okay, it didn't rain, we're starving. We had to have a meaning to it.
So let's talk about how Jung saw it, because he was very interested in both creativity and spirituality from the psychological and spiritual perspective. So how would you describe then the artistic process, the creative process from that Jungian perspective?
Well, if you look at the Red Book, the images that he, beautiful art, and then he would also have his patients draw mandalas and draw their dreams out and the symbols and all that. I think that where I think Jung and Freud diverged, and Freud was, more of the mind is just kind of repressing and it's information storage, where Jung saw this as a live psyche. I think that's really where he said that's where the imagination comes from. I mean, Einstein was influenced by him, and a lot of these creative people used creative, like these inventors and stuff, use that imagination and creativity and visualization. All of that is creative. And so he was helping people find that creativity, find that access. And I think most of us are conditioned to be rational creatures. We're conditioned to make rational decisions, play it safe, do what conforms with everyone else. But then there's this other part of us that wants to live. And I think that at midlife, that's where we feel that urge. Some of us feel that artistic urge earlier than others, but it's that idea, like you said, to create something new, and that newness is through us. And so that's what I see his individuation process is about. And then the tools he used were dream interpretation, symbols, working with visualization, like I said, active imagination, using drawings. And then now there's like sand play, and there's a bunch of other like physical things that people do, and even dance and just different ways to move your body, movement, to get into that creative part of ourselves. So it's out of that rational, linear, logical mind and into the imagination.
Yeah, I think he just blew everyone away with this idea that the unconscious was creative.
Yes.
Freud had kind of taught everyone that the unconscious was this repository of repressed and discarded memories and wishes that were unacceptable. But Jung said, no, there are deeper layers to the unconscious that are actually creative. Like it's its own intelligence, it's its own mind, it has its own will, its own direction, and it is the source and fountain of creativity. If you look at great art, it comes through people, not it's not the individual figuring something out and creating it. It's that they're compelled to express something deeper from within them. And that deeper layer is the collective unconscious.
It's almost like we are all sitting at the top of the ocean, and this collective unconscious is all the creativity and all the possibilities. And then each of us has a direct access to it, and we can kind of pull things up and bring them to the surface for everyone to see and say, wow, look what I've created here. And I think it's on the surface, we're all trying to remind each other that we're all one, and that we're all creative, and that we're all, seeing other aspects of ourselves. So someone who could sing and perform beautiful music is still a part of us that's not maybe doing that right now. But it's still a part of us, and we enjoy it. And being the listener is the audience for that person, the voice to be heard. So the art needs to be seen by others. It needs to be witnessed in a way. And so if you just keep the art to yourself, it's not really, it doesn't have its full extent of its creative power.
One of the interesting dynamics, of course, is that those ideas, those archetypal ideas that we call great art, and do come through individuals. And often the individual is completely sideswiped, or has just,
I didn't ask for this gift.
yes, by this calling in them, that like they're being used to bring forth these ideas into the world. And often it hurts them and destroys them. We see this in kind of, I wouldn't say it's with all artists. We know there's artists that somehow find a balance in their life. But those unique artists, right, that self-destruct or find it very difficult to kind of live up to the challenge of being this conduit for creative ideas.
And do you think it's the art itself that they're opening themselves up to this creative force, and they don't have a strong enough ego to hold this powerful creative information that's flowing through them? Or do you think it's their inflated expectation of others for them, and they're kind of I guess it's both, right? It's that kind of an inflation of, I am the artist, and I am the doing all this stuff. And I remember Michelangelo said that he didn't create the David, God created the David, and he just chipped away the excess so we could see it. And that's kind of what we need to do as artists and as creative people in the world, is that whatever we're bringing forth is not ours, like the egos. It's the divine, and it's to acknowledge that and not be attached to it. But I don't think we think like an artist who hasn't done individuation doesn't think that way. And then they're battling with all this powerful creative dreams and inspiration, and they can, it's almost like madness in a way. It can go drive them to madness if they don't know how to work psychologically with all this content that's emerging through them.
Yeah, there's a great movie, Amadeus. Most people have seen Amadeus, which is the story of Mozart. And you see there the dynamics of the persona shadow playing out in the creative process. So you have this kid who's Amadeus, starts very early on, and he's a genius at music, very inspired from the get-go. So his persona, of course, starts getting built up. But they didn't understand this mechanism of persona shadow back then, and his persona got so big. And if you believe you are the persona as that artist, then you're buying into that. This is me creating this incredible music. I am the genius. I am, and of course there is something to that. It is you that is it's expressing that. Yeah. But without doing shadow work, meaning without understanding that there's a price to pay for that. It keeps building up and building up and building up this incredibly powerful shadow that's going to crush everything you've created at the persona level.
And that's why we see so many brilliant artists die of overdoses and have tragedies in their life, Michael Jackson. I mean, what happened to him? I mean, he had abuse in his childhood from his father. He was a childhood star, but never came to terms with all of that. And it's so tragic what happened to him. You know, he tried to change his persona, you know, and then, you know, all that fame and all that money, but he wasn't grounded in a reality that could help him. Yeah, it's just really tragic. And, you know, I think that a lot of artists do go to drugs or some kind of, you know, mechanism.
Self-medication.
To kind of deal with all this content that's coming forth through them. Some of us are, you know, most of us, you know, that don't have that like streamline of consciousness. A lot of us, you know, can keep it at bay because we have a very strong ego. But other people that, you know, just kind of more open to that creative process, they need to kind of do their shadow work to build up the ego, so the conscious mind can relate to this unconscious. The conscious mind, we can't just let go of the conscious mind and just go into the unconscious, and because it can lead to, there's no structure to kind of bring them back. And even artists, like actors, it's like they sometimes believe that they're the famous person, or they play a role. They have to extract themselves from the role afterwards, the method acting, where they actually live and become that person, that character. There's a process for them to let go of it. But for most of us, we're not trained in a process, so we believe we're the character. And then when you're a creative person, and then you have all this expectation on you of fame that could give you this false sense of superiority when it's just an inflation of the ego.
Yeah, that's what Jung meant by ego inflation, is that when you believe you are this creative genius as persona, or you're identifying with the persona, then the ego is inflated, meaning it becomes this grandiose sense of yourself that is going to create a very powerful opposite shadow, meaning all that genius is not goes into the shadow element, and the shadow acts as a balancing point. So as the ego inflates and gets overblown, the shadow acts like a thorn that's going to pop that balloon. It's going to pop the inflated ego. And it's not going to be pretty, of course, because it's going to wreck everything that the genius has created from through their personality.
So it's the tragedy of being a creative untamed or untrained with how to access this creativity. You need to understand how to utilize and channel that energy versus just go in there and be creative and then not know like what to do next in the times when you're not. And then there's also, maybe we could talk about that, those moments where someone has that creative flow and then it shuts down and they have that kind of writer's block or creative block. And I've worked, when I was a hypnotherapist, I worked with a lot of artists who had creative block, and they would work with me on, you know, getting in their mind and helping them be more creative again, help them draw again. And there's a lot of, what I've discovered is this shadow with those people that were blocked creatively. There was a fear of people rejecting them or not approving of their work. And when you're in your ego, of course you're going to be afraid of what people think because you're taking credit for the work. But if you don't take credit or blame, then you can truly be yourself. You can truly, a performer is the best performer when they don't care what people think. They're just kind of in a zone and they act. And I always know when I'm writing, if I'm writing to have an agenda of what I want to say versus just kind of opening up and just letting myself write.
Absolutely. So the conflict between persona and shadow in these cases would be solved, as Jung would say, because it's a spiritual question.
Yes.
So here we see, again, the relationship between creativity and spirituality. That if they understood that this creativity is a spiritual journey that I'm on, it would protect them from that ego inflation.
Yes.
They would essentially see it as, it's not me, right? I, the individual, am not the one that is creating this art. It is coming through me. I'm expressing it. And indeed, we see some artists that were able to manage that process in their own way, right? They hadn't read Jung, but they understood intuitively that it's not me. It's not the ego that is creating this. It's this divinity, like Michelangelo said, right? It's the divine. I'm giving credit to the divine, to the collective unconscious, as Jung would say.
And I think it is really important to remember that you have to have a strong conscious relation, like a kind of sense of consciousness of yourself before you can enter the unconscious, the deeper collective unconscious, and all that creativity. Or you can lose yourself in there, and then you'll take credit for everything that you get. And I mean, this happens in all industries, any kind of, even as someone who's in the corporate world that is the CEO or founder, or Elon Musk, or what's his name, the guy who shoots the Tesla guy, that's Elon Musk. But if they believe that they're that person, that's a superstar, it will bite them if they don't deal with the shadow.
Yeah. And we see, I mean, on a larger scale, we see it in the collective consciousness, in the collective culture, because we're so lopsided towards the rational side, trying to figure everything out and solve everything rationally, while building up that shadow, building up the opposing energy of creativity, and it kind of has to do with the acknowledging and kind of giving the divine its due. When we don't do that, then we accumulate that shadow and strengthen the shadow element. If you think about the Aztecs, what they would do is they would have ritual sacrifices, not as many people believe as some kind of dark magic or anything like that. It was that they understood this principle. If you don't acknowledge the divine by somehow connecting with it, giving back to it, acknowledging that everything is arising from that divine source, then you build up the shadow. And it's going to take its revenge on you, and it's going to demand its due at an not an opportunistic time, meaning on its own playing ground.
When you least expect it.
Yes, and in its own chaotic way.
Well, it's kind of like the Ring, when the Ring had all that power, and when the person would identify with it, and they just they kind of get mesmerized with the power and how destructive it was. Yeah.
In the Lord of the Rings.
Lord of the Rings. And it's and so how do we use, artists can use the collective unconscious to create their art. How do we, if we're not an artist, can we use art to individuate? And the use of art in Jung, he drew mandalas, he drew pictures of his dreams. I find imagination, just visual. For me, when I didn't know I used to love to write, but one thing I love is I always had a good imagination to create stories. And so what I loved about what came out in me when I stepped into individuation was I realized how much I love writing visualizations and writing that kind of short story and using that imagination. It's kind of like writing a little mini film and writing those. So that for me was a way to access creativity. Active imagination is a way that Jung would say you just let your creative mind, this other part of your mind, the non-rational mind, interact with these symbols that are arising, and dance and music, like we talked about before, is a way that we can learn to interact with the unconscious. If we try to go toward it in a logical way, it's just not going to give us what we need. You have to kind of be creative to be with the creative aspect of ourselves.
Very much so. Yes, that's a great question. It's like, if it is not us, if it's not the individual and then who is the one that is expressing this? So the concept of the self, and Jung has a little bit of difference between the Eastern philosophy of the self, of the higher self. But in general, he's talking about the same principle, that the true self is the essence of us. So this is the way the Upanishads explain it. If you think about your mind, your individual mind, it's a type of filter that collects information about your personal experiences, and it stores your personal memories, your individual way of doing things. So that's our individuality right there. But what allows it to do that in the Upanishads, it says, is a pure consciousness, a pure awareness that
kind of like holds it, like you can't exist without it.
Yes, that allows it to do that. In other words, the individual mind is arising within that pure consciousness and is a part of that pure consciousness, and that is the true self in us. It is the true self in us, and it is the source of everything that we're experiencing.
And we are all that consciousness.
Yes, and the error from that perspective, the error is that we believe we are the individual mind with its ego. And that ego then gets into trouble when it believes that this power, this creative power, is coming from it, from the individual ego mind.
It's almost like, it's almost irrational to think that if you haven't had a personal experience of something that's in your informational processing bucket that your mind creates, then where else did this creativity come from? Then if it came from a deeper part of yourself or a deeper spiritual essence, then that isn't you, your persona, that you're getting that information. Your ego is just collecting and remembering and learning how to speak. And maybe if you're a teacher, like you said, a coach or a mentor, they're sharing through the instrument of the body and the memory of what they've collected from their deeper self. But the wisdom is always coming from the same source. If they say, this is my wisdom, I created this wisdom, then they're off the rails. But they can deliver the wisdom, but it's not theirs. They're the messenger of the wisdom. Does that make sense? And then everyone has a different way to label it and express it in different cultures. The yin and the yang, and the persona shadow, and the masculine, feminine, or Shakti, Shiva. There are many, many words and ways to express, but it's all one truth. Ultimately, at the base of everything is one truth.
Yeah, and that was Jung's purpose. He wanted to develop a psychology that accounted for these deeper principles that, there's no point in ignoring them. If we say, well, they're simply like superstitions or part of our ancient past, and they have no place in our modern world, we're throwing away the best part of our human experience just to be rational and to appear to be civilized and all this. It is the raw source of mystery, like the definition of spirituality is, that we need to include it in our modern world. There is still this mystery that we'll never solve logically, but that we have to come to terms with.
That's why I love Jung's work, because it is not it takes a while to grapple with it, it's hard at first, but because it's creative, and so it makes us question things and learn things. Even Eastern philosophy, sometimes it's like, what? I'm not the ego, and there's no I, and how does that work? And so it's not that instant, oh, that makes a lot of sense. Like everything happens for a reason. Oh, I believe that. Like that, the easy stuff to learn is more like in line with our rational self. But the creative spirituality is really those things that we feel like we don't get right away. We have to sit with, we have to contemplate, we have to understand, and then we get that knowing on a deep level. And then it's really powerful, instead of just repeating something that you heard in a Bible or another text that sounds good, or posting a nice little quote on Facebook thinking I'm wise, but if you don't really wrestle with it and things that sometimes when I'll post Jung, I'll notice that people have this like challenge what he's saying. And it's good because that's really what we want. We want to have someone who says, that doesn't make sense. Yeah, that's Carl Jung. If you read Jung, sometimes he doesn't make any sense until he does. And then you look at it from that perspective. But yeah, we are all, we're all divine. I always say we have spiritual amnesia. We just forget that that's who we are. But we also don't want to throw away the ego. We don't want to dismiss our human mind, our rational mind, because it gives us an opportunity to have an individual experience of the divine, only as us in this life, in this moment. So we want to have both, but we want to remember who we are in the whole system. Don't get lost in the ego, and then just don't want to escape to the divine. We want to have that integration of human spirit expression.
So
what else do you have, Rob?
I just wanted to reiterate the definitions.
Okay.
So remember, the definition of spirituality is the search for meaning. It's the relationship with a mystery, and it's about transformation.
Okay.
And then the definition of creativity is the process of bringing something new into being. It is the expression of the authentic true self, and it is this higher knowledge, and higher knowledge is always leading us towards that true self. Yeah,
beautiful. Well, this was a great topic today. So those of you who haven't done anything creative lately, it's time to bring something new into being in your life. What's something new you can bring into your life, into being? And then really look for where do you as you look for your sense of meaning in your life. And even if you feel I think it's really important that if you feel lost, if you feel confused or you don't know what the meaning is, you're on the right track because there's a part of you that's desiring for that meaning. So it's good to have that instead of thinking, not even thinking about life, not even asking those questions. I mean, I know some people that go through life and they're just kind of in automotion. They go to their job. They don't even question why they have meaning until something happens. Like a friend dies, a parent dies, they get sick, lose a job, and all of a sudden it's like, what is my life about? So we want to search for it before those things happen, and that's what makes life worth living. I mean, the good and bad, having the ego, having to deal with this personality, the conditioning of our mind, but also knowing that there's also this creative part of us that can bring new things in. So
absolutely.
Beautiful. So you already enlightened? You just forgot? It's time to wake up. Jung's work is really powerful. So we highly recommend it. All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We'll see you next week. We are starting a new series. And we're going to start a series because we've been doing a lot of work with the collective unconscious and spirituality. And before that, we talked about the archetypes. And so now we're going to talk about the next series about mindset and what's going on the conscious level. How do we deal with this consciousness that we have, the conscious, not consciousness and the big consciousness, but this little c, conscious awareness, conscious experience that we have. And what is it? A little bit of psychology,
the ego, the persona,
the mind, the cognition, like how we perceive things. It's going to be a great series. So we hope to see you next week for another fabulous episode of Soul Sessions with Creative Minds.
Thanks for watching.
Have a fabulous rest of your day, and I will